4 recruits cornered her in the armory, blocking exits, flexing egos, thinking they had her figured out. "You going to make us?" One laughed, reaching for her arm. Another grabbed at the weapons rack behind her. They thought the quiet contractor would finally break. But seconds later, they were the ones on the floor, bruised, bleeding, and asking the same desperate question, "What the hell are you?" Her answer ensured no one on that base ever looked at her the same way again. The base armory smelled like gun oil and concrete. Steel racks lined the walls in perfect rows, each holding M4 seconds, saws, and sidearms that hadn't moved in weeks. Everything had a place. Everything had a log. Everything was accounted for. For weeks, the woman checking those logs had done her job without saying more than 10 words to anyone. Elena Cross, most people on base, didn't even know her name. To the recruits, she was just that quiet contractor, the one with the faded fatigues and the clipboard who showed up early every morning and disappeared before evening chow. Her badge said civilian contractor, logistics, no unit, no rank, nothing that would make anyone look twice. The truth was more complicated. Elena Cross had been medically evacuated from Kandahar months earlier. An IED blast had torn through her convoy, killing 2 Marines and leaving her with shrapnel lodged between her L4 and L5 vertebrae too close to the spinal cord to remove safely, but not close enough to paralyze her. The Navy called it career limiting. Elena called it Tuesday. She'd spent months in physical therapy, relearning how to run, how to carry weight, how to move without the sharp lightning that used to shoot down her right leg. The doctor said she was lucky. The brass said she was done. "You can't deploy with that injury," the medical board had told her. "One wrong fall, one bad landing, and you're in a wheelchair for life." So they offered her options. Medical retirement with full benefits, a desk job at the Pentagon, or a training position at Little Creek. Elena chose none of them. Instead, she volunteered for the contractor program, temporary civilian positions on bases that needed experienced personnel for specialized work. It kept her close to the military without technically being in it, letting her serve while the Navy figured out whether she was permanently broken or just dented. But if you paid attention, really paid attention, things didn't quite add up. Like how she handled weapons with the kind of confidence that only came from muscle memory, or how she moved through the armory like she'd memorized every corner, always positioning herself with clear sight lines to the exits. There was a scar, too, thin and pale, running from her collarbone up into her neck, the kind that didn't come from accidents. Her boots were military issue but broken in hard, double-wrapped laces, tread patterns that spoke of real miles, not parade ground marching. Most of the NCOs gave her respectful space. They'd nod when they passed, maybe ask how the inventory was coming along. She'd answer briefly, professionally, then get back to work. But the younger soldiers, especially the latest rotation from Fort Jackson, weren't so respectful. They whispered, speculated, said she acted like she owned the place. "Bet she's some admin washout who needed a paycheck," one had said. "Probably taught ROTC at some community college," another laughed. None of them knew anything for sure, but that quiet confidence, that way she had of looking right through them, it got under their skin, made them curious, made them bold. Which is why one evening, when she stayed late to finish cataloging suppressors, 4 recruits decided it was time to figure out what her deal really was. They called themselves the Bravo Pack, not officially, just a nickname that had stuck among the 4 Army recruits who'd arrived together from Fort Jackson for a cross-training rotation. Advanced weapons maintenance and base coordination at one of the biggest facilities in the state. Brennan Chase was the unofficial leader, 22 years old, sharp jaw, perfect posture, son of a colonel, and it showed in every step he took. He'd been team captain in high school, class president, the kind of guy who'd never had to ask for respect because it just followed him around. Mickey Dale was his hype man, shorter, wiry, with a crooked grin and the habit of laughing too loud at Chase's jokes. He lived to amplify whatever energy Chase brought to a room. Cole Madden was the muscle, built like he'd spent high school in the weight room, which he had. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was usually about who he could take in a fight. And Jonas Rivera, the youngest of the group, sharp-eyed and reckless, the kind who'd volunteer for the most dangerous assignments just to feel his heart rate spike. They weren't the worst recruits the base had ever seen, just young men who'd never learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. The truth was, they'd arrived with something to prove. This wasn't their first training rotation. All four had washed out of their initial specialized programs. Chase had failed Ranger selection, made it through the physical requirements but couldn't handle the psychological pressure. Dale had been dropped from airborne school for attitude problems. Madden had been removed from combat engineer training after a disciplinary incident involving a female instructor. Rivera had been kicked out of military intelligence for interpersonal conflicts with superior officers. None of them talked about these failures. Instead, they'd formed their own narrative. They'd been held back by politics, by instructors who didn't recognize their potential, by a system that favored the connected over the competent. This rotation was their last chance to prove themselves before being assigned to regular infantry positions, the kind of unglamorous postings that wouldn't look good on resumes or impress girls back home. They needed a win, and Elena Cross had become their favorite puzzle. The first real encounter happened near the cleaning station, where Elena had been breaking down an M249 for routine maintenance. She worked methodically, field stripping the weapon like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Chase wandered over, with Dale trailing behind, both trying to look casual. "Damn," Chase said, just loud enough to carry. "She handles that like she's about to ship out." Elena didn't look up. "Maybe she's practicing," Dale added with a smirk. "You know, pretending she's a real soldier." They laughed. Elena kept working. That was the first thing that bothered Chase, being completely ignored. Back home, when he talked, people listened. Here, this contractor acted like he wasn't even there. "I'm talking to you," he said, stepping closer. Elena glanced up briefly, her eyes dark and unimpressed. "I heard you. I'm working. Real serious work. Counting guns," Dale said. Elena set down the bolt carrier and looked at Chase directly for the first time. "Is there something you need? Just being friendly. Most people around here appreciate that. I'm sure they do." She went back to the weapon. The dismissal was quiet but complete. Chase felt his jaw tighten. "You know, it wouldn't kill you to be social once in a while." Elena didn't respond, just reassembled the SAW with practiced efficiency and moved to the next item on her list. Chase and Dale exchanged glances. This wasn't over. Over the next few days, they tested her. Too close passes in the corridors, comments just loud enough for her to hear. Rivera once accidentally knocked over a stack of cleaning supplies near her workstation. Elena didn't react, didn't complain, just cleaned up the mess and kept working. The second real confrontation came days later. Elena was in the vehicle maintenance bay, inventorying night vision equipment that had been transferred from the Armory. The bay was mostly empty, just her and a couple of mechanics working on a Humvee 2 bays over. That's when all four of them showed up. "Well, well," Chase said, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "Look who's branching out." Elena glanced up briefly from the PVS -14 seconds she was cataloging. Bays closed for inventory. "Good thing we're not here for maintenance," Dale said, positioning himself near the bay entrance. The mechanics looked up from their work, sensing tension. One of them, a staff sergeant with grease-stained coveralls, started to approach. Chase waved him off. "We're good here, Sergeant. Just talking to the contractor." The staff sergeant hesitated, looked at Elena, then back at the four recruits. Something in their positioning, their body language, made him uneasy, but Elena nodded slightly at him, a gesture that said she could handle it. He returned to his work, but kept watching. Rivera circled around behind Elena while she worked, pretending to examine equipment. "You know, we've been wondering about you. Nothing to wonder about." Madden leaned against the tool cart. "See, that's where you're wrong. Everyone has a story. Everyone talks, except you." Elena continued her count, marking items on her sheet, but now she was tracking all four of them, positions, movements, potential weapons within reach. The bay had good sightlines but limited exits, not ideal, but workable. "Maybe she's hiding something," Dale suggested. "Maybe she's just antisocial," Chase said, stepping closer to her workstation, close enough that she had to look up. "Maybe you should find somewhere else to be," Elena said quietly. Chase smiled. "Not friendly. This is a public area. We have every right to be here." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then went back to her inventory, but her pen grip had changed ready position. Now, you know what I think, Rivera said from behind her. I think you're not what you pretend to be. Elena finished the line she was writing, set down her pen, and turned to face him. What do you think I'm pretending to be? Some hotshot contractor with special clearance. But really, you're just another civilian who couldn't hack it in the real military. The mechanics had stopped working entirely now. The staff sergeant's hand rested on his radio, ready to call for backup. Elena looked at each of the 4 recruits, her expression calm but measuring. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge they hadn't heard before. You need to leave now. Chase laughed. Or what? Elena didn't answer. She simply gathered her equipment and started walking toward the exit. They let her go this time, but as she passed Chase, he called out, "This isn't over." Elena stopped, turned back, and met his eyes directly. "Yeah," she said quietly, "It Island." The staff sergeant watched her leave, then looked at the 4 recruits, who were still standing there like they'd accomplished something. He keyed his radio and called the duty desk. Some situations needed to be documented before they got out of hand, and somehow that made them more determined to get a reaction. Sergeant Calvin Porter had been watching the whole thing develop. 30 years in the Army had taught him to recognize trouble before it started brewing. He'd noticed how the 4 recruits circled Elena like they were working up the courage to poke a sleeping dog. He'd also noticed things about Elena that the recruits had missed: the way she moved, the way her eyes tracked movement, how she positioned herself in any room, like someone who'd learned to expect contact from unexpected angles. One afternoon, he found Chase and Dale loitering near the Armory entrance, supposedly waiting for their weapons maintenance assignment, but mostly just talking loud enough for everyone to hear their opinions about base personnel. Some people need to learn how things work around here, Dale was saying. You can't just ignore everyone and expect to fit in. It's about respect, Chase agreed. Basic social skills. Porter approached with the measured pace that made junior personnel suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. You boys got something on your minds. Chase straightened, his posture snapping into something resembling military bearing. Just discussing integration, Sergeant. How everyone needs to be part of the team. Integration? Porter repeated slowly. That what you call harassment these days? Dale's face went pink. We're not harassing anyone, Sergeant. Just trying to be friendly. And the contractor, she appreciate this friendliness? Chase shrugged. Hard to say. She doesn't talk much. Maybe she's got reasons for that. Like what? Porter studied them both for a long moment. There were things he suspected about Elena Cross, but suspicion wasn't knowledge, and there were protocols about discussing personnel with trainees who didn't need to know. But the staff sergeant from the motor pool had filed his report. 4 recruits, 1 contractor, escalating tension, the kind of situation that could go sideways fast if someone didn't intervene. Porter had seen Elena's file, not the classified parts. He didn't have that clearance, but he'd seen enough to know she wasn't what she appeared. The requisition forms she signed with her left hand, despite being naturally right-handed. How she could estimate ammunition weights without checking the scales. The way she'd once corrected a Marine sergeant's field stripping technique without even looking at what he was doing. Most telling was the morning he'd watched her run, not the pace, though 5-minute miles suggested serious training, but how she moved when she thought no one was watching. The tactical breathing, the way she varied her route slightly each day, how she'd pause at certain points along the perimeter, scanning like she was conducting reconnaissance rather than just exercising. 30 years in the Army had taught Porter to recognize operators. Elena Cross might be wearing civilian clothes, but she moved like someone who'd spent time in places where situational awareness meant survival. But there were other ways to deliver warnings. You ever hear the saying, "Still waters run deep"? Yeah, I guess. Means some people are quiet because they got nothing to say. Others are quiet because they got too much to say and they're smart enough to keep it to themselves. Porter let that settle. Smart people figure out which kind they're dealing with before they do something stupid. Chase's expression tightened. You saying we're being stupid? I'm saying you're young soldiers in a new place, trying to figure out where you fit. That's normal. But I'm also saying you're circling someone you don't understand, and that's dangerous. Dangerous? How? Porter was quiet for a long moment, looking across the motor pool where mechanics were starting their evening routines. The most dangerous people don't advertise it, he said finally. They don't talk tough, don't start fights, don't go around proving how hard they are. They just are. And if you push them far enough, you find out what dangerous really means. You saying she's dangerous? I'm saying some folks stay quiet because they've walked through loud places. Smart people respect that. Chase was quiet, but Porter could see the wheels turning, pride wrestling with caution. Understood, Sergeant, Chase said finally, but his tone suggested he'd heard the words without accepting the message. Porter recognized that tone. He'd heard it from young soldiers before, right before they learned hard lessons. I hope so, son, because some mistakes you only get to make once. As he walked away, Porter found himself hoping Chase was smarter than he looked. But experience had taught him that hope wasn't always enough. Some people had to touch the fire to learn it was hot. When Elena Cross realized she wasn't alone in the armory, she'd been cross-checking serial numbers in the back section, where they kept the suppressors and specialized optics. The main lights had dimmed to night cycle, leaving just the security floods that cast everything in harsh shadows. The door had opened quietly, too quietly for someone with legitimate business. 4 sets of footsteps, moving with purpose but trying to sound casual. Elena didn't look up from her clipboard, but her grip shifted slightly, pen between her fingers now, not beside them. 4 hostile contacts, standard box formation, 1 controlling the exit, 2 flanking, 1 taking point. They might not have realized they were using textbook containment tactics, but their instincts were sound. The armory gave her advantages and disadvantages. Advantages: lots of hard surfaces for redirection, limited space favored close quarters combat, multiple potential improvised weapons. Disadvantages: no secondary exits, concrete floors would amplify noise, and any real violence in here would trigger automatic security protocols. She cataloged their positions without moving her head. Chase, 6 feet directly ahead, trying to project authority. Rivera, 8 feet to her left, fidgety energy, suggesting he'd move first. Dale, 12 feet behind her and to the right, blocking the main exit but far enough away to be the last threat. Madden, 10 feet to her right, biggest target but also biggest reach. If this went physical, Rivera would be first. He was wound too tight to wait for someone else to start. Chase would follow immediately, trying to maintain his leadership position. Madden would rely on size and strength, probably try to grapple. Dale would either run or try to help whoever was winning. Standard tactics would be to neutralize the most dangerous threats first, but in a confined space with multiple attackers, you went for speed and shock value. Take down the closest threats as violently as possible to demoralize the others. Elena had run this scenario in her head dozens of times during training close quarters combat in confined spaces against multiple opponents. The key was to never let them coordinate, never give them time to think. But first, she'd try to de-escalate, because the paperwork for a civilian contractor hospitalizing 4 recruits would be a nightmare. Working late again, Chase's voice carried across the space. System, pace, policy. Yeah, she said quietly. It'll just be me then. Elena didn't answer immediately, just kept working, her movements precise and deliberate. The recruits spread out, 1 by the door, 1 near the main racks, 2 moving to flank her position. Standard containment, whether they knew it or not. Evening? Rivera asked, his voice coming from her left now. You always this dedicated, or just avoiding people? Elena finished the line she was writing, then slowly turned to face them. Chase stood directly in front of her, maybe 6 feet away, close enough to be intimidating, far enough to claim it wasn't threatening. Is there something you need? She asked. Yeah, Chase said, some conversation. Everyone on this base gets along, except you. Dale laughed from near the door. See that attitude right there? Like you're better than everyone else. Elena scanned their positions again. Exit routes, potential weapons, distance calculations, old habits. I'm not better than anyone, she said quietly. I just prefer to work alone. Well, tonight you don't get to, Rivera said, stepping closer. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Elena looked at each of them in turn, her expression calm but measuring. When she spoke, her voice carried a tone that made smart people listen. Walk away. Chase laughed. What, now? It wasn't loud, wasn't angry, just final. For a moment they hesitated. Something in her voice, in her posture, suggested they were missing something important. But then Chase stepped forward, emboldened by his audience. You don't get to give orders here. He reached for her clipboard. Elena didn't move away. Instead, she set the clipboard down carefully on the shelf beside her. You sure about this? She asked. Rivera grinned and grabbed her arm. That was the moment everything changed. The arm Rivera grabbed wasn't soft, wasn't yielding, it felt like steel cable wrapped in skin. Elena turned her head slowly, looked at his hand on her bicep, then met his eyes. Bad choice, she said. Before he could react, her free hand came up and grabbed his wrist, not to pull away, but to control the joint. She stepped back, twisted, and sent him stumbling sideways into a weapons rack with a crash of metal on metal. Dale rushed forward from the door. Elena pivoted to meet him, her elbow driving backward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The sound of impact echoed through the armory as the air left his lungs in a strangled wheeze. Madden was already moving, thinking size and strength would win the day. He never made it 2 steps. Elena dropped low, swept his legs, and used his own momentum to send him crashing face first into the concrete floor. Chase lunged desperately, trying to wrap her up in a bear hug. Elena slipped inside his reach, drove her shoulder into his midsection, and lifted him off his feet before slamming him down onto the unforgiving tile. The entire fight lasted seconds. When it was over, 4 recruits lay scattered across the armory floor like broken toys. Dale gasped for air that wouldn't come. Rivera clutched his wrist against his chest. Madden wasn't moving. Chase sat propped against a weapons rack, blood trickling from his nose, his eyes glazed with shock. Elena stood in the center of the destruction, breathing steady, not even winded. She picked up her clipboard and looked down at Chase. Who are you? He mumbled through the blood. Elena crouched down so they were eye level. Petty Officer First Class Elena Cross, United States Navy, SEAL Team 2, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Somalia, she said, pausing to let that sink in. 37 confirmed kills, 16 hand-to-hand. She stood up, straightened her uniform shirt. I'm not a contractor. I'm on medical leave while the Navy decides if my injuries are permanent. They put me here because I can still serve without being a liability. She looked around at all of them. I changed my schedule to avoid this. I stayed quiet, kept to myself, gave you every chance to leave me alone. But you decided quiet meant weak. Rivera managed to whisper, we didn't know. No, you didn't. Because you never bothered to find out. You made assumptions based on arrogance, and that almost got you killed. She walked to the supply closet, pulled out a first aid kit, and tossed it on the floor between them. Clean yourselves up, file whatever report you want, but understand this. I tried to be the person who avoids trouble. You forced me to be the person who ends it. She gathered her papers, checked her watch, and headed for the door. Anyone else want to test whether I'm antisocial? No one answered. Elena nodded once and walked out, leaving 4 young men who had just learned the hardest lesson of their military careers. Some people stay quiet because they have nothing to prove. Others stay quiet because they've already proven everything. By morning, the story had spread through the entire base. 4 recruits had cornered a civilian contractor in the armory, tried to intimidate her, and discovered she was an ex-Navy SEAL who put them all on the ground without breaking a sweat. The official investigation began promptly. Colonel Marcus Webb had been base commander for years, long enough to know that incidents like this didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone always saw something coming. Someone always failed to report it. Someone always thought they could handle it informally before it escalated. The first person he called was Sergeant Porter. You knew this was building, Webb said. It wasn't a question. Porter sat at attention in the commander's office. Yes, sir. I warned the recruits, filed observation reports on their behavior. And the contractor? Limited interaction, sir, but I suspected she had a military background. Webb pulled out a tablet, swiped to Elena's file. The classified portions painted a different picture than her contractor application. Elena Cross, Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Command, 2 combat deployments. Silver Star recipient for actions during a hostage rescue operation in Somalia that saved 8 civilian aid workers and 3 fellow SEALs. Medical evacuation from Afghanistan following an IED attack. Months of rehabilitation. Currently on medical leave pending permanent disability determination. She's not just ex-military, Sergeant, Webb said. She's one of the best operators the Navy's produced in the last decade. Porter's expression didn't change, but Webb caught the slight widening of his eyes. The recruits, Webb continued, closing the file. Brennan Chase, medical discharge. His nose will heal, but the psychological evaluation shows he's not suitable for continued military service. Too aggressive, poor judgment under stress. He moved to the next folder. Mickey Dale and Jonas Rivera. Suspended pending disciplinary review. Dale will probably get administrative separation. Rivera might get another chance if he can prove he's learned something. And Madden, weeks of medical leave, then reassignment to non-combat logistics. The concussion was worse than initially thought. No more frontline positions. Porter absorbed this silently. Webb leaned back in his chair. Tell me, Sergeant, in your professional opinion, how badly could this have gone? Porter considered the question carefully. Sir, if Petty Officer Cross had felt genuinely threatened, if she'd believed they intended sexual assault or serious bodily harm, we'd be dealing with fatalities, not bruises. She held back considerably, sir. Everything I saw suggested a controlled response, minimum necessary force. She could have killed any or all of them with her bare hands. Webb nodded grimly. The SecNav's office has already called. They want to know how 4 of our recruits ended up in the hospital after attacking a decorated Navy SEAL. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. This isn't just about discipline, Porter. This is about the culture we've allowed to develop here. When 4 young men think they can corner a woman and intimidate her without consequences, we failed somewhere along the chain of command. Yes, sir. New policy. Effective immediately. All contractor personnel with military backgrounds will have their service records made available to unit commanders, not classified details, but enough to ensure proper respect. Webb turned back to face Porter. And I want mandatory briefings for all incoming personnel about respecting civilians on base, regardless of their apparent position or background. Make it clear that every person here deserves basic human dignity. Roger that, sir. As Porter stood to leave, Webb added, one more thing. Find out where Petty Officer Cross requested transfer to. I want to write a personal letter of recommendation for her file. She showed remarkable restraint under extreme provocation. That's exactly the kind of person we need more of in uniform, not fewer. The official reports were classified. The recruits were quietly transferred to different units. Chase received a medical discharge when it became clear his injuries would affect his ability to complete training. But the legend grew anyway. None of them ever spoke publicly about what happened, but the lesson traveled. When the next rotation of recruits arrived, Sergeant Porter added something to their orientation briefing. Not everyone who stays quiet has nothing to say. Some folks have seen things, done things. They don't need to prove anything because they already have. He looked at the fresh faces in front of him. The most dangerous person in the room is usually the one who never says a word. Remember that. In the dimly lit armory of a military base, where the scent of gun oil and concrete hung heavy, Elena Cross taught us a profound lesson about the danger of underestimating others and the strength found in quiet resilience. A former Navy SEAL, scarred by war and carrying shrapnel in her spine, Elena chose silence over bravado, working as a contractor while the Navy decided her fate. Yet, 4 recruits, blinded by arrogance, mistook her quiet demeanor for weakness, cornering her with taunts and threats. In seconds, she dismantled their egos and their bodies with surgical precision, revealing not just her lethal skill but a deeper truth. The most powerful people often don't need to prove themselves. Her restraint, despite her ability to end lives, speaks to a discipline forged in the crucible of combat, a discipline that demands respect, not demands it. This story stirs a raw emotion, a mix of awe and humility, reminding us that every person we meet carries an unseen story. Judging someone by their silence or appearance can lead to costly mistakes, not just in a fight but in life. Elena's choice to stay quiet wasn't cowardice. It was a shield, protecting her peace until pushed too far. Her actions force us to reflect. How often do we misjudge others, assuming we know their worth? This tale urges us to approach everyone with respect, to listen before we speak, and to recognize that true strength often hides in plain sight. What's a moment when you or someone you know was underestimated, and how did it change you? Share your story in the comments. Your voice could spark the next tale we tell. If Elena's quiet strength moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Dignity Defended for more stories of hidden warriors. Share this with a veteran whose story deserves to be heard, and dive into more tales of courage on the end screen. Let's honor the unsung heroes together.